Masechet Baba Mesia Daf Samech Vav. We're going to study the next clause in a Baraita that we started already. And here we see a case of Machar lo bait, machar lo sadeh, v'amar lo, lichsheyu li ma'ot hachazirem li asur. Someone sells a house or a field, and the seller says, listen, I feel bad that I have to sell my field. It's a really nice field that I like, but what can I do? I'm out of money. However, he says, listen, if and when I get more money, I want you to return it to me. In that case, that's prohibited. Basically, he's putting a condition in the sale that if he should, let's say the sale is $100,000 for this field, here I'm giving you $100,000. If I make money, at some point, then I want to buy the field back. This is prohibited because it's like interest. Basically, the seller is getting $100,000 from the buyer, and then he will and giving the field kind of like as a deposit. In the meantime, the buyer enjoys the produce of the field, and then sometime later he comes up with $100,000, returns it. So you can see this as see the lender as a borrower who's borrowing $100,000 and the buyer as a lender. And so he's loaning $100,000. In the meantime, he gets the benefit of the produce. Well, that's like interest. And so even though technically this is a sale, but it effectively, it's the same thing as a loan, because he made a condition within the sale that if once he comes up with the money, then he can get the land back. Well, that's the same thing as taking out a loan and giving the field as a deposit, in which case the buyer or lender cannot enjoy the produce in the meantime, because that would be interest. So in that direction is prohibited. However, look at the other direction. If it's not the seller that makes a condition in the sale, but rather the buyer that makes an offer, and the buyer sees that the seller is sad that he has to sell his field, and the buyer says, don't worry, whenever you have money, just bring me the money and I will return it to you. We're going to see in a minute that this statement by the buyer is not binding. It's not a condition in the sale. He's just saying, if I decide I want to, bring me the money and hopefully I'll be a nice guy. But because he doesn't have to return it, it's not a condition. So therefore, this sale is a final sale. If they decide later on that they want to make another sale, look, you're always allowed to sell and sell it back and sell it to someone else. That's definitely permitted. But if it's a condition in the sale, then it works like a loan. As long as it's not binding, then it's permitted, and the fact that the buyer is enjoying the produce in the meantime, that's fine. It's totally his. If he decides to sell it back later at the same price, at a different price, that's a new transaction. And this is not like a loan. Good. Mantana amar Rav Huna bered Rav Yehoshua dela kerebi Yehuda di kerebi Yehuda ha'amar sadechad berebit mutar. Regarding the first case where, according to this Baraita, it's not permitted, says who is the author of this Baraita? So it cannot be Rabbi Yehuda, because as we said before, Rabbi Yehuda says that the interest in making a deal is only prohibited if it definitely will come to interest. But if there's a possibility that interest will not be paid, then it's permitted. And in this case, it's not for sure that he's going to come up with the money and be able to get his land back, right? The seller may never get his money, may never come up with the money, and therefore it'll be a final sale. The buyer will keep it forever and enjoy the produce, and so there won't be any problem of interest, since that's one possible outcome, and it's not for sure interest. So according to Yehuda, it will be permitted. So obviously the author of this Baraita is not Rabbi Yehuda. Ma'ishna Resha or Ma'ishna Sefa. Now, what is the difference between the Resha and the Sefa? How come the Resha is prohibited and the Sefa is permitted? Amar Rava. Now, these next words do not appear in any manuscript. As you can see here, right, these words Resha Delo Amar Lemidate were found in the Cincino and Venice printed editions. Cincino was first, Venice was second. And from there, they made it into the Vilna Shas, although in the Vilna Shas, they're in parentheses, meaning that it should be deleted. And that is correct that it should be deleted, because as you can see here, they do not appear in any manuscript. This seems to be some kind of a gloss or commentary that was stuck in, but it does not belong there and is also difficult to explain. So we're going to skip those words. We're going to see Ravaz quoted below also, only with the last four words, not with this Resha part. Amar Rava, Sefa damar le midate. So Rava explains that in the Sefa, that's when the buyer offers of his own accord to say, listen, if you come up with the money, Mr. Seller, then I'll decide at that point, and maybe I'll give it back to you, right? Hopefully, we can work out a deal. Don't be so sad. So because he offers it of his own accord, and it's not binding, therefore, the condition is not binding. His offer to return the field is not binding. Therefore, the sale is a final sale, and it doesn't look like a loan. Whereas in the Resha, where it's the seller that makes the condition, he's making it a condition in the sale. It's not a final sale, and therefore it's the same thing as he's just borrowing that money, the $100,000 in the meantime, and then he will give it back and get his land back. However, during that time period, the buyer is enjoying the produce, and that would be interest. Good. Okay, now we have also a case of a buyer and seller, where the seller sold some land to his friend, but without a guarantee. Normally, a buyer who's cognizant should say, listen, I'm buying your land for $100,000 here. I want a warranty, a guarantee that, let's say, it gets repossessed by some creditor that you have, that you will pay me back for the land. However, the buyer didn't remember to say that, and so there's no guarantee on the land. Now, they finished the deal. Now, the seller sees that the buyer is sad. And so the seller says, why are you sad? Don't worry about it. If it ends up getting repossessed, I'll give you a warranty, and I will give you from the best quality of my land to make up for it, and I'll even pay for any improvement that you put on the land. I'll cover that, and any produce that's taken away when the land is repossessed, I will cover that as well. Don't worry. So the seller is offering it. Amad Amemad Pitume Mile Be'almahu. Amemad says that offer by the seller is not binding. He just said pitum, like pitum haketoret. Pitum is to fatten up, to make something nicer. These are just nice words of enticement, but they are not binding, because in this case, it's the buyer that has to make the condition, not the seller. You see, this case is actually the opposite of the case that we said before. The basic rule is, whoever is getting the protection of the law has to make the condition. And so in the case above, where the seller wants to get his land back if he comes up with the money, so he wants protection that just in case he comes up with the money, he can get his land back. So if he wants the benefit of that, of the benefit of the condition, whoever's getting benefit from the condition has to make the condition for it to be binding. If it's the other person that loses benefit, that doesn't get it, says it, then he's just saying it as a nice pacifying statement, but it is not binding. So in the case we saw before in the Baraita, it's the seller that needs to make the condition in order for it to be binding. In this case, because it's the buyer that will benefit from the condition, because he'll have the protection of the warranty, so the buyer needs to say, listen, I'll buy it, but if it gets repossessed, then you have to pay me back. So then if the buyer says it, it's binding. In this case, if the seller says it, it's not binding. And that's why Meimad explains it is not binding in this case. Amar le Rav Shela Meimad. Tamamai, Rav Shela Meimad. What's the reason why you say that it's not binding in this case? Kevan de lokeach ba'el atnuye vehacha mocher ka matne. Amat bitume mile be'al mahu. Is it because it's the buyer? In a case like this, for a warranty, the buyer needs to make the condition that I'll get paid back. And here, it's the seller who said it. And therefore, the seller is only saying it to pacify the buyer. but it's not a binding condition. Okay, if so, I have a question from that baraita. Ela matnita dekatane lichsheyu lecha ma'ot achazir lecha mutar democher hu deba'e la'atnuye mocher la'atne v'lokeach kamatne. Now in the baraita, it was in fact the opposite case, where when the buyer says, when you have money, Mr. Seller, then I'll give it back to you. And that's permitted because that is not binding, because in that case, it's the seller that needs to make the condition, and the seller did not make condition, the buyer made the condition, right? Okay, so far, so good, right? It makes sense that these cases should be the opposite because it's a different person that is benefiting from the condition. That's not the question yet. And we asked about that baraita just above. What's the difference between the resha and the sefa, where the resha is not allowed and the sefa is allowed? So Rava explained in the sefa, because it's the buyer that made the condition, and he said it on his own, of his own accord. We're understanding Rava now that means he said, if I decide of my own accord to return the land to you, then I will return it to you. But he had to say that. We're understanding Rava that he said it explicitly, right? In other words, they're making the sale, and I guess the seller probably seems sad, and the buyer says, listen, if you come up with the money, come to me, and I may decide, I will consider giving the land back to you, right? He's leaving it open as a possibility, but he didn't say it as a guarantee. Now that's how we're understanding Rava right now, that it's not binding because the buyer did not say it as a guarantee. So we see that the only reason why this statement by the buyer is not binding is because he said it. Said, I'll consider it on my own will. But if he didn't say that, if the buyer said, I will give you back the land, then we would not say that these are just words of enticement. We would consider it binding. And that's the question, because in this case here, the other way around, where the buyer bought the land and didn't say a statement of guarantee, and then the seller said, don't worry, I will cover it. And he didn't say, if I want to. He didn't say, I'll consider covering it. If he said, I definitely will cover it, so doesn't that mean that it should be binding? That's the question. And Amar says no. When Rava says that he said it mida'ateh, you don't have to say explicitly that I'll consider it if I want to. Just by, even if without saying it explicitly, it's as if he said, I'll consider it if I want to. That's the general rule. So, to summarize the way it works, in order for a condition to be binding, it has to be the person that benefits from that condition has to say so, and then it's binding. If it's the other person that says, don't worry, I'll cover you. Either I'll give you your land back if you come up with the money, in the case of the baraita, or I will give a warranty on this land and pay you for the land. So because it's the other person who's not benefiting from the condition that says that gives the guarantee, we assume that person means that they'll consider it according to their will if they want to, but that then it's not a binding condition in the loan. They're just saying it to pacify the other person, and that's why in those cases it's not binding. Now we'll see yet another case where someone's statement is not binding. Someone was on his deathbed, a husband, and he's writing a get for his wife because if they're married when he dies, in this case they didn't have children, then she would be bound to his brother, who the guy on his deathbed did not want her to have to go through that trouble of having to do yibum or chalitza with the brother. So it's better for her, he cares about his wife, to give her a get. However, he moaned and sighed while he was preparing the get. Right? He's so sad that he has to divorce his wife, and maybe he'll get better. So Amrale Amaika mit nahat. And so his wife said, why are you sighing? Don't worry. Ikaimat didach ana. If you get better, I am yours. I will marry you again. Right? You don't have to sigh. I mean, he might be sighing that he's dying, but he's sighing particularly regarding the get, because he's like, oh, now there's no way back. Even if I get better, look, now I'm divorced. He says, don't worry, I will remarry you. Amar Rav Zavid pitume mileh baal mahu. Rav Zavid says that those words of the wife are not binding. Let's say he gets better and she says, you know what? I really want to stay divorced. She can stay divorced. This is not a condition in the get. Okay, that's Rav Zavid, right? Because she was saying that just to make him feel better. Amar le Rav Acha medifti le Ravina. V'ilav pitume mila mai. So Rav Acha medifti tells Ravina, isn't that obvious what Rav Zavid said? And what if you didn't say it's words of enticement? Would she have the power even to make a condition that's binding? Is it in her power to insert a condition in the get? Only the man can make a condition in the get. It's his prerogative to give the get, and only he can put a binding condition in the get. She has no power to do so. So obviously, it doesn't matter what she had in mind. Even if she had in mind that, yes, I'll give a binding condition. It doesn't matter what she thinks or says. No, I would have thought that the husband, when he writes the get, he's doing so on the basis of her condition, right? She said, don't worry, if you get better, I will marry you. And he says, okay, I agree to that condition, and gives her the get on that condition. So you might have thought that even though she says it, he has it in mind when he gives the get, and it's a binding condition. That's why Rav Zavid has to say, not so. And again here, the same principle. Who's benefiting from this condition? It would be the husband that would be benefiting. So if the husband makes the condition explicitly, here is a get on condition that I die. But if I get better, then it's not a get. Then that condition would be binding. But if she makes the condition, she's not the one that is standing to benefit from the condition. And therefore, when she says it, we assume she means, if I decide, it's up to her. And in this case, actually, she doesn't even have the ability to automatically put a condition in and say that the get would be invalid. So in this case, the get is for sure valid, and we don't say that the husband gave the get having in mind her condition, so she said it just to make him feel better, and then if he ends up getting better, then they'll have to actually get remarried again with her consent. Hilvahu al sadehu, the next part of the Mishnah, was a case where somebody lends money to the borrower, and the borrower gives the lender a field as collateral, and the lender says, if you don't pay from now until 3 years, that's the deadline. If it passes 3 years, then I get to keep the field. And the Mishnah says that is valid, as permitted, because it's not considered interest. Instead, it's considered a penalty. אמר רב הונא, בשעת מתן מעות קנה הכל, לאחר מתן מעות לא קנה אלא כנגד מעותיו. So now we're dealing with the case, let's say the loan was $100,000 and the field is worth $150,000. So how is that going to work? So Rav Huna makes a distinction. It says if they make that stipulation at the time of the loan, then the lender can collect the entire field, even though the loan was only 100,000 and the field is worth 150. He keeps the entire thing because that's what they agreed to at the time of the loan, and that means the borrower agreed to that when he said, yes, you can keep the field. He really wanted to get the loan. He needed to convince the lender to do so, and he was sincere when he said, yes, you can keep it. However, if they make the stipulation after the loan is already given, after the money is already given and the loan is already agreed to, then the borrower, we can assume, only would have agreed to giving $100,000 worth of the field. Only part of the field, not the whole thing. Why should he give up the whole field more than the loan is worth? But the amount of the field, that he could say, oh, instead of paying you cash, if I go over the deadline, just take the field so that the lender won't have to go to court and repossess the field and all that. So he says, okay, fine, you could take $100,000 worth of it. So Rav Huna makes sense. Rav Nachman, however, says even if the borrower agrees and says, I'll give you the field, and he says it after the loan is already done, nevertheless, he also agrees to give over the entire field. We assume that his words are sincere, and he said exactly what he means. And he's like, yeah, don't worry, right? I'm definitely going to pay it. You can be rest assured that I'm going to pay it, and you could be so sure, you know what? If I don't pay, you could have the whole field. Okay. Abad Rab Nachman Obada Gaber Eshkeluta Kishma'ateh. Rav Nachman, he married into the family of the exilok of the Resh Galuta. And one time, he made an action. He was the judge over a case for the Resh Galuta, and he followed his own opinion. In other words, the Resh Galuta had a loan out, and the time came to collect, and the borrower didn't pay. So the Resh Galuta collected the field, and Rahman says, yes, go ahead, you can collect the field, the entire field, because he didn't pay. He followed his own opinion. But then, when that document got to Rav Yehuda tore it up and said, no go, you don't get to take the field. Rav Yehuda did not agree with that ruling. Amar le-Resh Galuta, Rav Yehuda kera lishtarach. So the Resh Galuta came back to Rav Nachman and says, you made the original judgment, however, Rav Yehuda overruled you and ripped up your document. Amar le dardeka kerae, gabra rabba kerae, hazabe ta'ama ukrae. Rav Nachman's reaction, and we're going to see two versions. In this version, he says, "Oh, I must have done something wrong, right? Is this a child? Is Rav Nachman a child? Rav Yehuda a child? No, he's a great man, and so he must have seen something wrong with it." And that's why he tore it up, right? We can go ask him why he tore it up. That's one version. The other version says, Rav Nachman says he tore it up. It's like a child tore it up. Of course, Rav Yehuda was a great sage, but Rav Nachman, compared to everybody else, Rav Nachman was an expert in monetary matters, and therefore he says, everybody else is like a child compared to me, and so, he's wrong, and my original ruling was right. I'm guessing that the second version is the original, and maybe the first version is trying to tone it down, that not to say that Rav Nachman is calling Rav Yehuda a child, but in fact, sometimes the sages had sharp remarks about each other. Okay, so that's the case. Now, Hadar Amar Rav Nachman afil beshat matan ma'ot lo kana velo kelum. Rav Nachman originally said that even if you make the stipulation after the loan, still the lender can collect the entire field. That was his original position. But then he looked into it again, and he changed his mind. Actually, maybe this would fit better with the first version, that, Rav Yehuda must have done something. Maybe he went and asked him and looked into it again and changed his mind. And so now he said, you know what? He goes from one extreme to the other extreme. He says, even if they agree on the stipulation at the time of the handing over the money of the loan, and they said, listen, and if I don't pay you back this loan, right, you agree that I agree that I'll give you the field, right? Seller says, you agree you're going to give me the field? He says, yes. Even if they do so at the time of the loan, still nothing happens. The field does not, the lender cannot keep the field. He does not get anything at all, not even the value of the field itself. When the time passes, then the lender will have to go to court, and court will say, okay, is there a guarantee of land? Okay, here's the land, and they have to go through the whole process in court. In the end, he may very well get that land or some other land, or get paid in some way, but he can't just automatically keep that land. So Rava asked Rav Nachman, very nice, you changed your mind, but now you're going against the Mishnah, right? The whole way we got here was that they were explaining the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if the lender makes a stipulation and says, listen, if you don't come and pay me from now until 3 years, then I'm keeping the field. And the Mishnah says that works, and it is his field. It's permitted to do this. It is valid. So Rav Nachman, how are you going to explain our Mishnah? אמר לה, אני עומד אסמכתה קניה, ומניומי עמד אסמכתה לקניה, ומניומי כשמתיתין, איבית אמה מתיתין רבי יוסי היא, דעמד אסמכתה קניה. So now we introduce this new term, asmachta. Asmachta means an inconclusive consent. It's where I say something, but it's not clear if I really mean it. It's kind of like a bet. Asmachta comes from the word of lismoch, just to give extra support for my words. If I want to really support my words, and you ask me to come to a meeting tomorrow and be on time, and I say I'll be there, I'll be on time. If I come late, I'll give you $1 million. So now let's say I actually come late. I really owe you $1 million? Obviously not. Everybody knows that that's just an expression to mean that don't worry, I'm really committed to coming, but I didn't sincerely decide that I'm actually going to give you $1 million if that doesn't happen. So that's called asmachta, and there's a big machloket Tanaim in Masechet Baba Batra, where Rabbi Yosef is of the opinion that asmachta kanya, and others say no, asmachta is not binding. Rabbi Yosef says it is binding. We assume that a person is sincere when he says a statement like that. Others say he is not. Okay, so Rav Nachman says, I used to think that asmachta kanya, and therefore, when a person says, I'll give you the field, even if he says it after the time of the loan, if he says, I'll give you the field if I don't pay, then he means it. That's what I used to say. However, I changed my mind, and now I agree with Minyomi. Minyomi says, asmachta is not binding, so I changed my mind. Okay, so now we just shift the question to Minyomi. Well, how is Minyomi going to explain our Mishnah? Because in our Mishnah, it sounds like it is binding. So we're going to have two answers. One is that our Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, who says asmachta kanya. So fine, that's one position. But Minyomi, and now Rav Nachman also, because he changed his mind, they all say, they follow the opinion against Rabbi Yosef, and they say asmachta la kanya. Although he said, even at the time of the loan, you can keep my field. Right? Or it's really the seller says, I'm going to keep your field, okay? He says, yeah, you can keep the field. Then, even though he said that, it was just to give support, to pacify the lender that he's really going to pay, but he didn't really mean to transfer the ownership of the field. That's one possibility. Or it could be that we're following an opinion that generally says asmachta la kanya. But even that opinion would agree that if you say from now, if you say retroactively, listen, if I don't pay, then this is your field from now. So because right now I'm handing over the field, maybe doing some formal acquisition, like with a handkerchief, and I'm saying, it is yours from now. When you do it from now and make an acquisition from now, then that shows that you really mean it. So even if you say asmachta la kanya, right? If I say I'll be there tomorrow on time, and also I'll pay $1 million, and I sign a contract, right, that says so, right? Then that makes, and that I'm transferring it from now. So then that certainly would be binding, because obviously then that person is sincere. אמרו לה, מריאנוקה מר קשישה בני דרב חיסטה דרב אשה. הכי אמרי נהרדאי משמי דרב נחמן. היי אסמכתה בזמני קניה, בלה זמנה לקניה. And so now, Yenuka and Mor Kashisha, younger and the elder sons of Rav Chisda, told Rav Asher, says this is what the Nehardeian rabbis said in the name of Rav Nachman. And asmachta, if it's at its time, then it works. If it's not at the time, then it does not work. It is not binding. So it's not clear what he means. Could be that this is related to this last answer here, that if it's at the time, meaning if the acquisition will happen from now, retroactively from now, well then it's binding, because then you really mean it. You made an acquisition now. But if you say, in 3 years from now, if this happens, then the field will be transferred, then that does not work, because it's way in the future, not at this time. Okay, that is one possible meaning of what Rav Nachman said. However, that is not the understanding that we're going to see in the next line. Amar lehu, kol midi bizmaneh kaneh belazmaneh la kaneh. Rav Asher asked them, oh, what did Rav Nachman mean by that? After all, there's no chidush here. Any contract will take effect at its time. It's not going to take effect at some future time, after the date that whenever the contract says that this thing should take effect. So what does Rav Nachman mean to say when he says asmachta works at its time, but is not effective not at its time? So Rav Asher has a suggestion. Dir mahachi kamritu. Maybe this is what Rav Asher, this is what Rav Nachman meant to say. Ashkache bego zimne v'amar le kaneh kaneh. Bata zimne v'amar le kaneh la kaneh. Mai ta'ama mechamat kisufa huda dekamar le. Perhaps if the borrower encounters the lender, and they had made a deal like this, and they said, listen, if a lender says, if you don't pay, been 3 years, I'm going to keep the field, right? And then they encounter each other before the due date. Begozimne, right, within the time means before the due date. And the borrower says, listen, I'm not planning to pay you cash. You know what? Just keep the field. If he says that, we assume he means it, because this is before the due date even came. He didn't have to say anything. So the fact that he's saying keep the field must be he's sincere. However, if the date already passed and he says, you know what? Just keep the field, then we do not think he's sincere. We do not think he means it. Why? He's saying this out of shame. He's embarrassed that he hasn't paid yet. And so he's saying, oh, what am I going to do? In his mind, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to try to get the money this way. He's thinking about ways to raise the money so he can pay off the loan. But he's embarrassed to say that. He says, oh, you know what? Keep the field. But he doesn't really mean it. Maybe that's what Rav Asher meant. Maybe that's what Rav Nachman meant. Velahi, but that cannot be. De'afilu begozimne name la kaneh. V'hede kamar le kaneh, kasabar kimate zimne, la lete litardan. No, in fact, even if the borrower before the due date says to keep the field, he doesn't mean it. And so why did he say keep the field? Because he's preempting. He's thinking when the time comes for payment, when the due date comes, it's going to be soon, whenever. I don't want the lender to have to come and start bothering me. I may need more time. I'm just like, I don't want to deal with him. So I am preempting and saying, keep the field, and that way he won't come and bother me. And then I will get the money at some point and I will pay it back. But it's not necessarily true that just because it's after the due date, then he means it, but before the due date, after due date doesn't mean it, but before the due date he means it. No, both after and before the due date, he is just telling the lender, keep the field, either because he's ashamed to say he doesn't have the money yet, or because he wants to stave off the lender from disturbing him, but he does not necessarily really mean it. Amara papa, hai asmachta, zimnin kanya v'zimnin la kanya. Okay, now papa has a new statement, and he says, asmachta, sometimes it makes an acquisition, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes he's sincere, sometimes he doesn't. He's not. How can you tell? So this is following up on this, where we're looking at before the time or after the time. Here we're looking at a different distinction. Ashkache deka shate shichra kaneh, deka mehapach azuze la kaneh. If the lender finds that the borrower is drinking beer, he's relaxing, he's having a drink, so that means that when he said keep the field, he really means it, because he's not trying to get some money together. He said keep the field, and that's it, he's good. So that means he meant it. But if he's looking around for money, he's like, seeing maybe he can sell some items, sell some land, find some money somewhere, borrow from someone else. If he sees doing that, then obviously he does not want to give over the field. He wants to come up with cash. And therefore, we see that he doesn't mean it when he says, keep the field. Okay, so that's the distinction. So Rav Acha tells Ravina, no, the fact that he's drinking beer doesn't mean he's relaxed and doesn't care to give up the field. Maybe it's the opposite. He's drinking so that he can calm himself. He's drinking some alcohol to calm himself down, because of all the financial pressure that he's under. He says, oh no, my field's going to go. I have to come up with the money. I need a drink. And so maybe actually that means the opposite, that he doesn't want to give up the field. Or maybe someone else said that they would put up the money for him, all right, that they would give him some money. And that's why he's relaxed, because he has the money coming from somewhere else. But really, he never meant to give up the field, and he's relaxed because someone else is going to give him the money. Doesn't mean that he's okay with the field leaving. So either way, he doesn't mean it. So Ravina has a new suggestion. How can you tell if someone's sincere or not? If they're very particular about money when they're selling, he's selling with olives or wine or whatever he's selling, and he is particular about getting the correct price, the highest price. Well, then that means that he for sure wants to give the field over. Why? If he was trying to come up with money in order to pay the loan and keep the field, then he'd be selling things at a discount. He's selling his items at a discount because he needs to come up with money. But if he says, no, I don't care, I'm not going to go through with the sale, he's very particular when he's selling things to be at market or value or even above market value, then that means he's okay with giving up. He's not trying to raise money. He's okay with giving up his field. Amar le Rav Acha medifti le Ravina. Dilma savar ki hechi de la titzil ad ae. Rav Acha told Ravina, maybe not. Maybe he has to have a show an appearance of not being desperate so that his other land that he owns will not go down in price. You see, if he goes and starts selling his goods at a fire sale, everybody was like, oh, look, see, he's desperate for money. And then other people, then they'll try to poach his lands and say, hey, he'll lose leverage when he's dealing with his other land. So he has to keep up a front of, I have plenty of money, and that's why he's not giving any discounts on his goods. So it's not necessarily true that he's okay with giving up his land. Maybe he doesn't want to give up his land. Rather, the Papa says it's a little change. Not that he is makpid on all of his things, the things that he's selling, all money, even goods, but rather if he's particular about other land that he's selling. And he says, someone makes an offer, a good offer on other land. And he says, no, I'm not taking it. Well, then obviously he's not strapped for cash, and he's okay with giving up the land to the lender. But if he's not particular when it comes to some other land, and he's willing to give a good deal to someone for other land, that means that he's selling to some other land in order to raise cash so that he can pay off the lender, so that he doesn't have to give up that particular field that he promised to the lender. So that's how you know. V'amar Papa, af al gav damod banan asmachta lakanya apotiki havya lemigba mina. Rav Papa also taught another halacha in this regard. It says, even though the rabbis said that asmachta does not make an acquisition, and therefore, if the lender says, hey, can I keep this land? Right, I'm going to keep this land if you don't pay me by 3 years, it's not effective, and the land does not automatically go to him, because even if the borrower says, yes, you can keep the land, we assume he does not mean it. Even though that's true, nevertheless, that land is considered apotiki, which means designated repayment. That would be the same as if the borrower said, listen, if I don't pay you cash by this time, then I'm designating this land that to be for your repayment, that you can come and repossess. You have to go to court and all that, but this land will be set aside. It's even better than having a general guarantee from a person's land. You put in the contract, if you write in the contract, right, you have a guarantee, and if I don't pay, you can collect from any of my land. This is even better because I'm designating a particular land, and so he's going to get that one. So Rav Papa says, even though the land does not automatically go to him, even though the borrower said, keep it, kaneh, we don't think he means he wasn't sincere. Nevertheless, it will act at least to be a designated land for repayment, and so that will make it easier for the lender to repossess that land. Amar le Rav Huna bered Rav Natan le Rav Papa, mikama le kene le gubaina. However, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Natan, told Rav Papa, I disagree. Did the borrower say acquire it as a form of debt collection? He didn't say that. All he said was take the land, but he didn't mean that, so that's nothing now. It's not even an apotiki. Amar le mor zutra vered Rav Mari leRavina v'amar keneh lemigba mineh kaneh sof sof asmachta hi v'asmachta la kanya. Mor zutra, the son of Rav Mari, told Ravina, and even if the borrower said, acquire it as an apotiki to collect the debt from this land, would that even work? Even that is a language of asmachta, right? If I don't pay, then you get to keep this, but then you can collect from this. But even that's an asmachta. He's just giving support to his words, but he doesn't even really mean that. And so, by saying whatever you say, kaneh, either you say, take this land, or this land will be yours to collect from. These are all asmachta, and none of them actually go through. Ela potikit amar papa maihi. So when Rav Papa said that there is a way to designate, if you say something, then that land is designated, what would be a formula by which we would know that a person really does mean to designate a land as for collection in case he doesn't pay? It's when the borrower says you will not receive payment except from this land, right? If I don't pay you cash on time, then you will repossess only from this land and from no other land. That case is then we know he really does mean it. That's not asmachta. Then he really does mean to designate that as apotiki. Now, one time there was someone who sold land to someone else with a guarantee, with a warranty. If it should be repossessed, then the seller will replace the land or give back the money to the buyer. Amale itarfu le minai magbit li me'ide idi te'itlach. And the buyer of the land says, listen, I don't just want any warranty. I want you to guarantee that if this land that I'm buying is taken away by other creditors, that you're going to give me from the best of the best. Idit is 3 levels of land. Idit is the best. But I don't want just any old idit. Within idit, there's even idit of idit, the best of the best. That's what I want from you. And the seller says, Amar le me'ide idit la magbina lach. De'be'ena lemekam kamai. The seller says, no, I'm not going to give you the best of the best because I want to keep that for myself. Rather, I'll give you the other superior, meaning like the worst of the best. It's still idit, it's within idit, but it's the lower level of idit. In the end, that land that he bought was in fact repossessed, so the buyer comes and he wants to get land instead, and turns out that Idit, the best of the best, got swamped by a flood, and now is not good. So now that best of the best goes down many levels, and now the best land that the seller has was what previously used to be the medium of the best, right? The lower level of the best. So now which one, what can the buyer repossess? So the Papa says, well, since the seller said that you can have the best, right? He says, I'm not giving you the best of the best. But now in any case, that's gone. But he says you can have the best, and that best is still there, right? The lower level best is still good. And so he has to give over that lower level best, right? Because that's what he told, that's what the seller said he would give in any case. No, but Rav Acha from Difti told Ravina, maybe not, because when the seller can make a claim and says, when I said I would give you the lower level of the best, that's when I had the best of the best, what that was still there. So I'm going to give you the second best that I have. But now that the best of my best is washed away and is not available anymore, so now the best thing that I have is what I previously was the second best. That became the best. And I said, I'm not going to give you the best thing that I have. I want to keep the best for myself. And therefore, he can claim that, no, now I'm going to give you the next best, whatever is after that, because it's not that the seller guaranteed to give the second best, that particular land that's second best at that time. Rather, he guaranteed that whatever is available at the time that the collection will happen, he's not going to give over the best of available, but only the second best available. So that's the two ways of interpreting what his words are once the best of the best is flooded. Rav bar Shaba hava masik be Rav Kahana zuze. Amar le, ila para'na lach liyom peloni geve mehai hamra. So Rav bar Shaba owed money to Rav Kahana. And then he said, Rav bar Shaba said, listen, if I don't pay you by this date, then you can take this wine. He had wine. So Sabara Papa Lememar Kemrin Asmachta Lakanya Hane Milebar Adelav Zabune Kaima Aval Chamra Kevan del Zabune Kae Kezuze Dame. So the Papa, when he saw this case, he at first thought to say that when we say Asmachta is not effective, that's only regarding land, because land is not typically sold. People generally want to keep their land forever as an inheritance, keep it in their family. Only if they're really desperate, they sell land. That's why when someone says, you know what, you can keep the land, we assume that he probably doesn't mean it. However, wine, he has wine to be sold. I mean, he's a winemaker or he's a merchant. And so since wine is there to be sold, then that's like money. He says, I'm going to pay you. If I don't pay you with cash, I'll pay you with wine. And so that we assume that he means it, and it's not an asmachta. Amar le Rav Huna, bered Rav Yoshua le Rav Papa, hachi amrinan mishemeh de Rabba kol dei lakaneh. However, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, corrected Rav Papa and says, no, this is what I heard in the name of Rabbah. Anytime you start a sentence with if, then you don't really mean it. It doesn't affect an acquisition, right? You're saying, if I don't pay, then whatever, I'll give you this land, I'll give you wine. All that is just saying an asmachta, is just giving support to say, I'm definitely going to pay you, don't worry, but it does not mean that the person really sincerely wants to give over that thing, and there's no distinction between land and a sellable item like wine. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.